έλεγεν αυτοίς γοτιγογιός του ανθρώπου παραδίδωται εις χέρας ανθρώπων, καί αποκτανούσιν αυτόν, καί αποκταντέis μετά τρεις γεμέρας αναστέσεται. Γόι δε εγνοούν το ρέμα, καί εφαμπούντα αυτόν эперотеса.
Окей. Как обычно, у нас это бывает в наших семинарах. Давайте вначале слово за слово пройдем. Уйдя оттуда, они шли через Галилею. Иисус хотел остаться неузнанным. Вот это один момент, который здесь нужно на нем остановиться как с точки зрения перевода, так и с точки зрения содержания. Каюк этилен генатис гной. Он не хотел, чтобы люди знали что? Чтобы люди знали его идентичность, чтобы люди знали, что он идет через Галилею, и чтобы люди знали, куда он идет. Потому что в дороге он наставлял своих учеников, говоря им, что Сын Человеческий будет отдан людям на расправу, что они убьют его, и что убитый он через 3 дня воскреснет. Это одно из тех мест, где мы раз за разом встречаемся вот с этим предсказанием. Да? И вопрос, который, может быть, нам осмысленно сейчас будет задать сами себе и тексту, это вопрос о том, что имеется в виду вот этим троекратным повторением и насколько разница в контекстах обусловливает и объясняет какие-то нюансы этих повторений. Ученики не понимали, что он говорит, а спросить боялись. Ну вот, as concerns the meaning of individual words and expressions and their translations, the only point that is important on that level is the translation and meaning of the Hinatis gnoi. What is the object of knowledge that Jesus wants to conceal? Does he want to conceal his identity, or he's going through Galilee, or something else?
Yeah, that's a good question. I also, well, and this relates to your translation of gar as potamushto.
Okay, but isn't потому что the most natural translation for Greek gar?
Well, the question is, how strong is this gar? And I think you're making it pretty strong by translating it as potamushto, whereas some have argued that gar in Mark, sometimes it can be an explanation for what is just gone, but sometimes it's a looser sort of connective, right? So I guess that's the question. And I think it is, so your translation, can we go up a little bit on your screen there?
Up. Okay.
Yeah. Okay, yeah. Well, okay. No, I guess, yeah, this is fine. He didn't want anybody to know because he was teaching his disciples these things. I mean, it seems like from the wording of verse 31 that that what he wants to conceal is not just his identity, but also this whole series of events that clusters around his death and resurrection. I guess that's the way I would take it. But I mean, it is one of those passages that sort of shows you what Vrede calls the artificialness of the messianic secret motif. Because, it says that they were puzzled by what he said and they were afraid to ask. Well, first of all, it isn't the first time that he said this. He said it already at the end of chapter 8 in more or less the same words. And why are they afraid to ask? I mean, there's no real motive given for their fear. So I think that's also an exegetical question. Why are they afraid to ask?
Okay.
But it
But
does seem
how
to me,
about,
yeah, it does
okay,
seem to me that the secret really is, not only maybe his identity as Son of Man, but what sort of Son of Man is this who suffers and dies? I mean, if we take the picture of the Son of Man from First Enoch, that is a glorious Son of Man. So the picture of a Son of Man suffering and dying, that's probably strange in a Jewish context.
by the way, Joel, how do you and contemporary Testament scholarship date that part of Enoch that speaks about the Son of Man? Because these chapters are absent, as far as I understand, from the Qumran Enoch manuscripts.
Yep, that's a problem. I mean, I want to date it early because it makes it much more useful for New Testament scholarship. But its absence from Qumran is a problem. I guess, I mean, one possibility is that they deliberately excluded it because they had some problem with it theologically, those chapters 37 to 71 of First Enoch. But I mean, it just makes so much sense of the New Testament's usage of Son of Man, that it's responding in some way to First Enoch. And especially the chapter, I think 25 of Matthew, the parable of the sheep and the goats. He's seated on a throne of glory, and there's almost exactly that same expression in First Enoch. So there's some connection there. I guess the other
Okay,
possibility is that First Enoch is responding to the Gospels. The similitude section is responding to the Gospels, and some have wanted to claim that. But
yeah,
I think most people do think that it's pre-Christian, that section. But maybe that's partly because we want it to be pre-Christian.
yes, the idea that probably the people of Qumran had some problems with this text and therefore excluded it from their library
Mhm.
is quite natural. We know that for some reason the book of Esther was absent from the Qumran library, though this cannot be used as an argument for the absence of the book of Esther in the Hebrew tradition, the Jewish tradition by that time. But what kind of theology might they have found offensive in these chapters of First Enoch?
Yeah, I forget what people argue. I think John Collins is one of those who thinks that, you know, they might have had some problem with it, but I can't remember what he says. I maybe they just, you know, didn't like this glorious divine figure, though I guess there's probably some overlap between the Son of Man figure in First Enoch and there's a Melchizedek fragment at Qumran. He also seems to be a heavenly figure, so I don't know. Maybe they preferred Melchizedek to Son of Man. I don't know. I can't remember what Collins says.
Okay.
But I wish it had turned up at Qumran. Maybe somewhere in the sands of the desert, it's there somewhere, and it just hasn't been found yet. I mean, I guess there, you know, there's like 5 books within First Enoch, and fragments of all of the other books have been found, except for chapters 37 to 71. But it is fragments, right? So it could just be a coincidence too, I guess.
2 years ago, a Russian priest published his dissertation on the historical Jesus. This is really an important event in Orthodox theology, because earlier it had been completely unheard of that Russian Orthodox priest can write something positive about the reconstruction of the historical Jesus. And in this book, obviously following some of the Western works, he stated that the absence of this book from Qumran library is a clear testimony that First Enoch is late and probably should be dated towards the end of the 1st century and post-Christian. I was asked to write a review on this, and I said that I cannot understand the logic. Then other explanations are also possible, including the one that you just brought. But
I think of recent scholars, the only one who thought that that section was late was Michael Knibb.
Michael?
Michael Knibb, Knibb, who
Mhm.
who did a I think he did an edition of the Ge'ez of Ge'ez with translation, but he's kind of lonely there. You know, most people think that it's pre-Christian.
Okay, thank you. And then coming back to our translation. When I compared Greek text with my translation, I thought that probably my translation «Иисус хотел остаться неузнанным» is not completely adequate with regard to the Greek text, because the Greek text does not explicitly say what was the knowledge the Jews wanted to conceal. And the answer to this question has a clear bearing on the translation.
So what's the so what's the import of the translation? That he wanted not to be known? That he wanted himself not to be known? Yeah.
Yes. In fact, the translation of my Russian translation into English would imply that he wanted that people around him didn't know, couldn't recognize him.
Yeah.
But for example, some English translations say he was unwilling for anyone to know about it.
Yeah.
This means this refers not to his identity, but to his going through Galilee.
Right. I'm just trying to see what I said.
And of course, this also is connected to the question, what was the idea behind this? What was the knowledge that he wanted to conceal, and why?
Yeah, I was one of those who said he didn't want anyone to know it, to know about. I mean, I guess you could say on a practical level, he might be hiding because he doesn't want, people hostile to him to get at him. I don't know if that was what I was implying in my translation or not. I guess I left it vague because I think the Greek leaves it vague.
Ну да. Окей. Может быть, вот так, например, ближе к тексту.
No.
Окей. Yes. But this is really by putting this in this way, we make the text a bit strange, and the reader. Now, the reader would ask us, what was the reason,
Well,
and what was the knowledge that you wanted to conceal?
That's
Про
good.
это.
That's good that they want to ask that. I mean,
Okay.
your translation shouldn't conceal a problem if there is a problem, I think.
Probably in the way now the Russian text would imply probably that Jesus didn't want that people knew that he is going through Galilee with his disciples, because he wanted to be with his disciples alone in order to teach him in a private, teach him privately about the future of the your stormtrooper.
Well, and that would seem to be the meaning of the gar, right? The gar points back
Yes.
to the previous clause.
Yes. Yes. In this case, my потому что is much more explainable and in place than with the earlier translation, with my earlier Russian translation.
Yeah. But isn't there some word that's less strong than потому что?
Mm. No, there's either there is a cause and effect link, or there is no cause and effect link.
Yeah. I mean,
Do we have in English something?
well, I usually used for, F-O-R, for gar. And, you know, that can imply because, or it can be a looser connection. It's not as strong as because. I think I would use because for hoti, but not for gar, generally.
Yeah, but in Russian we do not have. In Russian we do not have words that can be parallel to this opposition between for and because in English.
Uh-huh.
We would say that in English, for is slightly less pointing to the cause and effect relationship that because.
Yeah, I think I'd say that, yeah.
Я не знаю, друзья, а по-русски у нас есть что-нибудь, что придавало бы смысл потому что, но как бы чуть-чуть менее настойчиво? Мне кажется, нет.
Ведь
Мне кажется, ведь немножко про другое как-то. Чуть стилистически выбивается. Ведь может вводить какие-то независимые фразы, допустим, я ведь говорил тебе. Примерно сказать, потому что я говорил, это будет тоже немножко по-другому.
Irina suggests je. And what was Larissa's suggestion?
Же, о, ведь,
Yed.
ведь это as или for.
Okay. But I think that verse 30 and verse 32 are somehow correlate to each other because they both again and again speak about the idea of secretness. Jesus didn't want people to know something, and additionally, the disciples do not understand. А почему они боялись спросить?
Yeah, Jesus got his wish. He didn't want people to know, and his disciples don't know. They don't understand. So, I mean, there is some connection there, isn't there? There is a conceptual overlap between hined gnoi and hoide ignoon torema.
Yes, exactly. Even on the level of words, gnoi and agnoeo, of course, all the same. Same word. Okay, and the most important question about this pericope and her two sisters. What is the reason for this triple repetition? What was the symbolism of this? Because this is so important, obviously so important for the Marka narrative, that we should at least try to guess what was the reason behind this triple repetition.
So what triple repetition are you talking about?
3 times Jesus tells his disciples about his future suffering, death, and resurrection. And 3 times it is stressed that the disciples do not understand this, though at least on the second and third occurrence, they should have known this, because it's not the first time they hear this. They are so stupid that they not only at the first time they did not understand, but they did not understand also on the second and on the third. There is something important here for Mark, obviously.
Right, and also what Jesus says is not it's not mysterious. I mean, he is explicitly saying, I'm going to suffer and die and be resurrected. And, you know, as first century Jews, they would know what resurrection was. Again, you know, this is the sort of thing that Vreda cites to say that the messianic secret motif, as illustrated here, is, you know, you can't think of it in terms of like logical coherence in the narrative. It's rather the expression, Vreda says, of a dogmatic idea. And he would say the dogmatic idea is that the Messiah is hidden, has to be hidden during his lifetime, because it's only the resurrection that reveals who he is, or it's only his death and resurrection that reveals what sort of Messiah he is. So, and I think there's a lot to that. But, you know, maybe I should give a mini lecture about the messianic secret motif before we, like when we come to the third and final passion prediction at the end of chapter 10. Maybe I could do that.
Okay. Wouldn't you like to do this a bit in advance as a kind of prolepsis?
Sure, I could do it. I mean, I could present that next week if you want.
Okay, agreed.
I'll just, you know, I'll cannibalize. Do you have this word in Russian? I'll cannibalize I have an appendix about the messianic secret, so I'll draw from that and think about it some more.
Okay, let's look at the 3 places where Jesus predicts his passion. That's immediately after Peter's confession. And this prediction of passion is somehow, it is preceded by Jesus' dialogue with Peter, and it is followed by Jesus' dialogue with Peter. So I just thought that Peter was the highest of the apostles, so to speak, the symbol of power and authority within the early church. within the first church and the Jerusalem early Christian community.
Well, and Mark, in this first one, in verse 33, he does, I think we noticed this before, he does include the other disciples along with Peter in verse 33. So it's not just Peter's failing to realize, but somehow the other disciples are implicated. And probably for the reasons that you say, because he's the representative of the others and because he was an authority figure in the early church.
Yes, but other disciples, they just form the background for Jesus' dialogue with Peter. Here, in the verse that we look at now, his prediction of passion is followed also by Jesus' dialogue with his apostles, with his disciples, and it turns out that while Jesus was speaking about his own fate, they were speaking about authority and power. Who has the most authority? Who has the most power within the early church, within the community?
Well,
And
I
then,
think it's true, yeah, after each of these passion predictions, there's a reaction from the disciples that indicates that they don't understand, and then Jesus teaches them about discipleship. So there's a three-part pattern each time. Jesus predicts his passion, the disciples don't understand, and then he instructs them further. So
yes,
he doesn't leave them in their ignorance. He tries, he keeps trying to break through to them.
but I just wanted to point. That's true. That I just wanted to look at common things in the context. So these three predictions. Of course, in all three cases, the context depicts his disciples as people who do not understand Jesus, misunderstand him. But I think in all three places, they misunderstand. It seems that they misunderstand him. That their misunderstanding somehow is connected to the problem of authority and power. This is explicitly so in the second prediction that we just read, because immediately after this prediction, it turns out they were we're discussing who has more authority and power. The same is true with regard to the third prediction, because the structure is the same. After he's telling his disciples about his future suffering, death, and resurrection, they start somehow to discuss who is the most important. But
who's the greatest?
My question is, this thematic, this topical similarity between second and third prediction is evident. But take into account that the first prediction is specifically connected with Jesus' dialogue with Peter. Can we say that there's also points that in the first prediction as well, the question of power within the early Christian community is somehow in the background. What did you say?
Well, I'm initially skeptical. I mean, I see it in the second and third cases and not so much in the first. I mean, of course, you're bringing in the whole issue of Peter's authority in the early church, which I do think the gospel is assuming. And but the gospel is also undermining that, by having Peter, being misunderstanding in a very important way in chapter 8, and then, of course, ending up denying Jesus. But okay, maybe implicitly, the question of authority, of Peter's authority, would have come to the mind of a reader, possibly, in chapter 8. I'm
Yes.
willing to go with you,
Okay.
but I'm still skeptical. I'd need more proof.
Because after all, we speak about individual words, then on the next level we speak about the meaning of individual pericopes and scenes and sayings.
Well,
But
yeah,
question is,
yeah.
what was the reason for Mark to write his gospel?
That's a good question. I mean, another relevant passage is at the very end, in chapter 16, verse 7, maybe the second to the last passage from the end. But go, say to his disciples and to Peter, he's going before you into Galilee. I mean, so on the one hand, that does single Peter out as, the only one who's mentioned specifically. But what does it imply about whether or not Peter is a disciple? And some have wanted to go so far as to say that it's a criticism and it's withholding from him the title of disciple. I don't really agree with that, but you could read it that way. Because you could read it as if it's talking about two different groups. One, Jesus' disciples, and two, Peter, who has fallen away from being a disciple. That's not the way I read it. I think I would read it instead, tell his other disciples and also Peter. But still, it's an interesting formulation, which I'm pretty sure the other gospels reformulate.
I have some feeling that probably is right, probably is wrong, some idea that some of the reasons for Mark to write his gospel was a kind of a protest against the authority and hierarchy in the church, and the fact that the three predictions that obviously form, in some sense, the backbone of the gospel, because these are the three predictions that lead to the most important part of the gospel, to the passion narrative. Yes, that they all are in the context of where the question of disciples' power and authority is somehow.
That I think that's right. And it's another thing that there is in all three of those predictions is a reference to the hodos, the way. Jesus was ente hodo. And at the end of this section, he's going to be going up in Ente Hodo, going into Jerusalem. And Bartimaeus follows him Ente Hodo. So in each of the Passion predictions, there's a connection also with the Hodos of Jesus. But what is that Hodos? That's a Hodos that leads to suffering and death. And so you could say it's undermining, and people have wanted to say it's undermining conventional assumptions about authority. What is authority? Well, the Son of Man's authority is to go to suffering and death. And so some people have, and I think I mentioned this before, this sort of anti-Jerusalem church interpretation of Mark was particularly popular in the United States in the 60s. And I don't think that's a coincidence. You know, it was because then everybody was in revolt against authority, including the authority of the church. So I see a connection there between that, you know, what things were like 50 years ago. But I do also think that there's something to this interpretation, though I don't want to go as far as some people wanted to go in the 60s and say the disciples represent the enemies of Mark's community. I think that's going too far. Because after all, Jesus does say that he will see them again in Galilee. So, you know, it's not like they've screwed everything up and they're going to be cast out. You know,
But this is the same logic that we have in the Old Testament, that the people sinned and they are being reproached, but still there is hope, and not just hope, but you may be assured that finally, at least the remainder will return to God.
yeah,
So
I think that's very important. Yeah.
So I think that here Mark just follows the same pattern that was
right.
So clear in the Old Testament in many prophetic books. Okay.
But there are people, you know, who have said that the disciples' sin is so grievous, you know, that you know, they all run away and that's the end for them, and they are and so they are not the model disciples. The model disciples for this interpretation are people like the woman, the Syrophoenician woman in chapter 7, the woman with the flow of blood in chapter 5 or 6. You know, these anonymous characters who, you know, reach out to Jesus and he heals them. That's the model of discipleship. Whereas the disciples are a negative model. But I think that, again, that's going too far. It's too black and white. And I think, you know, for Mark, discipleship is not a matter of black and white. It's a matter of gray.
Okay. Друзья, скажите, в отношении перевода, экзегезы или чего бы ни было еще связано вот с этими 3 стихами, есть у нас еще какие-то вопросы, на которых мы хотели бы остановиться? Хорошо. Лариса, тогда давайте мы просим вас продолжить наше чтение, стихи 33, 34, 35.
Kai elton eis Cafarnaum. Kai ente oikia genomenos eperota autus. Ti ente godo dialogidzeste. Goi de Esiopon. Pros alelus gar dialectesan ente godo tismeitson. Kai katisas efonasen tus dodeka kai legi autois eitis telei protos einai eises estai pantan eschatos kai pantan diakonos.
Они пришли в Капернаум. Когда они вошли в дом, может быть, можно сделать ближе к греческому тексту, когда они были в доме. Наверное, да, можно. Иисус спросил учеников: «О чем вы говорили дорогой?» Они молчали, так как дорогой спорили друг с другом, кто главнее. Он сел, подозвал 12 и говорит им: «Если кто-то из вас хочет быть первым, пусть он будет последним из всех и слугой для всех». Мне кажется, на уровне слов здесь все достаточно понятно, и даже на уровне как бы комментарии, истолкования этого текста мы тоже только что говорили. Joel, do you have any comments on these words, on this dialogue, in addition to what we have already said?
Well, yeah. Well, first of all, just in terms of like source and tradition, it's interesting because it's the first of two stories about Jesus and children. In the next chapter, there's children are brought to him to bless, and disciples say no, but Jesus says, "Let them come to me." And there's a saying about children which is similar to what we have here. So I think it's a doublet, and maybe reflecting, going back to oral tradition, variant forms of a story or a saying. So so that's interesting, just literarily. And there aren't many of these doublets in Mark. There are a lot more in Matthew and Luke. And I think that's because Matthew and Luke are drawing on both Mark and Q. And so, there's that's why there's more doublets in Matthew and Luke than there are in Mark. But I also think that just in terms of what happens here, it's interesting to me that Jesus doesn't rebuke the disciples for wanting to be first, but it's just a question of what's the method of becoming first. Whereas I think, at least in our church in America, most people would say, oh, this is so bad that the disciples want to be first. But I don't think that's the presupposition in the story. Seems like it's a legitimate desire to be first, but the question is how you become first. And then paradoxically, you become first by becoming last.
Okay. Speaking about children, we move, in fact, into the next pericope. Лариса, давайте мы вас попросим еще 2 стиха прочесть, 36-37.
Сейчас. Καλαμπών παϊδίον έστεσεν αυτο εν μέσω αυτών, καί εγκαλισάμενος αυτο έπεν αυτοis. Γος αν εν τόν το ιούντον παϊδίον, δέξετε επί το ονόματι μου εμέδεχετάι. Kai gos an emedechetai, uk emedechetai, Laton apostelen tame.
Спасибо. Он взял ребенка, поставил перед ними, обнял и сказал: кто ради меня принят к себе такое дитя, тот меня примет. А принявший меня, он принял не меня, а того, кем я послан. Of course, the picture of Jesus and children is well known to us. It's a standard illustration on the first page of every children's Bible. And it's understood in a rather sentimental mode, at least in our culture. But for the Jewish milieu of the beginning of the first century CE, should we assume that the image of a child, the image of children, necessarily had primarily these sentimental connotations?
I would say no. And I would say that, and I would say that the primary thing about children is that they don't know anything, and that they're not like religiously qualified. You know, you don't become, I mean, the bar and bat mitzvah is, you know, maybe a later rite, but I think it symbolizes something that was present before, and that's that a child can't fully take the religious obligations on him or herself. And so I guess when, you know, I was thinking about this, it seemed like more important is the idea of the helplessness of the child, the lack of knowledge, the dependence of the child, that those are the things that are important. Yeah, so in verse 37, I mean, he talks about receiving me, and in chapter 10, you know, he's going to say you have to receive me like a child. So I don't think that's developed here, but it is in this doublet in chapter 10. So I think it's it doesn't have this sort of sentimental overlay that it would have in our culture.
Okay, so in this context of discussing the question of authority,
Mm.
the child is brought here into the picture as a symbol of one who has no authority, no power, the most authoritative less and the most powerless being.
Yeah, I don't think it's an accident. Like in the Pauline epistles, you have the pairing of the child with the slave and with women, right? So they're all humans who lack authority and who are under somebody else's authority.
Okay. So it is as though if we replace here the image of a child with that of a slave or a woman, the main idea would be the same.
I guess so, though, though also they're all slightly different too. Just partly because of, the way we feel about children and the way they must have felt about their children too. So it's not as there isn't the same degree of contempt that one might have for a slave, and that would have been part of the cultural code. But still, I think, but I come back to the pairing of the child, the slave, and the woman as people who lack authority.
So it's a kind of a subversion of normal human hierarchy.
I think that's right. Yeah.
Okay. Is it a correct English expression? Subversion of hierarchy, no?
Yes. Very good. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's
But
turning things, a world turned upside down.
yes, exactly. But what we hear here, what we have here in verse 37, is this a continuation of the same image with the same purpose, or is it a switching of the topic just because the picture of a child was already brought into the picture? Then we have some saying about the child that is not directly related to the context that originally was responsible for bringing the image of a child here. What would you say?
I think it is switching, isn't it? And it's becoming more talking about the child as an image of the disciple, right? And if you receive, so anyone whom I send out and you receive, it's as if you're receiving me. So I think that's a turn of the image.
So in fact, in verse 36, read in the light of preceding discussion, the child is something which is opposition to the disciples. You are quarreling, you're discussing who is the greatest, who has more authority, but here, completely differently from you, the children. There's something completely different from you on the other side. And then in the next verse, the child becomes, in fact, an image of Jesus' disciples.
Yeah, I guess you could say that, yeah, the child is being used in in verses 35 and 36 as an image of what the disciples are not doing. They are not giving up their authority. And then in verse 37, child becomes an image of what the disciples should be doing, or how Jesus will equip them, to he wants them to be received in the same way that he is received. And people have pointed out parallels in rabbinic sources. There's an aphorism about a man's shaliach, a man's messenger is the same thing as the man himself, kamohu. So again, even though that's much later, it seems to be the same sort of idea, that if you receive somebody who is sent out by somebody, it's as if you're receiving that person themselves. But you can see how that's also appropriate for a child, like if you're a father or a mother and you send your kid and the person, is rude or mean or cruel to your kid, it's like you have been yourself insulted. So I think there is some continuity with the child image, even though it's transposing to the disciple image.
Yes. And then we have several verses that seem to interrupt the topic of children, because it seems that the direct continuation of verse 37 is not verse 38, but rather a direct continuation of verse 37 should be verse 41 or even 42.
Yeah, I think that's a good observation. It does seem to interrupt the context. Maybe that's a sign that Mark put it in here into a pre-existent collection. And I think many have argued that, this does, just like in the parable chapter, he's probably taken that from a pre-existent collection. There may have been a pre-existent collection of sayings about discipleship that he has inherited, and maybe he's put in, these verses that interrupt into that collection.
So I would suggest that the collection about children, of Jesus' sayings about children and discipleship and hoi mikroi.
Yeah.
It was a collection which maybe pre-Markan, but Mark is responsible for interrupting this in order to put verses 38 and 39 here.
Which are also about issues of authority, right?
Yes, that's.
But as you say, verse 37 makes a nice connection with verse 41. So maybe Mark has, he's seen, I've got this collection of sayings about authority and about discipleship, and I'll put this one in there too.
Okay.
It's interesting, we haven't read through those verses yet, but verse 40, whoever is not with us, whoever is not against us is for us, right? Matthew has the opposite. Whoever is not for us is against us. And Luke has both of them. So, Luke's the great harmonizer, I think. But it's interesting that there's, two opposite forms of this saying in verse 40, one of which says the opposite of what verse 40 says. Because verse 40 is saying, look, these guys, they may not be members of our group, but they're doing basically the same stuff we're doing. So don't exclude them. Don't cast them out. Whereas in Matthew, the saying is the opposite. If you're not a member of our group, then you're against us.
But the two sayings are equivalent if we agree that there is no green zone. You may be either for or against. And in this case, to say that everyone who is against is not for us, and to say that everyone who is not for us is against us, these two sayings would be synonymal.
Oh, yeah, I'm not sure, because I think verse 40 is saying that there's kind of a third group of those. They aren't members of our group, but they aren't against us. They're, they're sympathizers. So I think there's a gray area in verse 40, which there isn't in the saying in Matthew. In Matthew, you're either with us or against us. And I think Mark chapter 9, verse 40 is challenging that, complicating it.
And if these two sayings are different, and moreover, they are a sign of some inner, some discussion within the early Christian community, what form is the early one, and what form is just an attempt to counteract and counterbalance the more traditional.
The one in Matthew, whoever is not with us is against us, that sounds more like standard apocalyptic stuff, right? You have the elect and the damned. Whereas I think you could make a case that verse 40 reflects more later experience of the church, where it's not always that simple who's in and who's out. And I guess I would see, verse 40 actually is sort of like something that is in Matthew that isn't in any of the other gospels, and that's the parable of the weeds. Don't tear them out. In the parable of the weeds, the disciples want to come and remove, or the ones who stand for the disciples want to come and tear out the weeds, and Jesus says, no, not yet. You shouldn't make premature decisions. So I guess if I had to guess, I would think that the Matthean form is earlier, and this form is maybe from the church. But I don't know, but maybe it goes back to Jesus too. I'd like to think that it goes back to Jesus, because it's not as uncompromising and apocalyptic in a very sort of dualistic sense.
So in this case, you deviate from the idea of Markan primacy.
Well, Markan primacy in terms of theology. Yeah. No, yeah, well, okay. No, so yeah, I guess I would say that, and I think there are cases where this happens, where Matthew may have preserved an earlier form than you have in Mark.
Окей.
Yeah.
Я думаю, что некоторые моменты, которые связаны с стихами 36-37, их естественно будет к ним, может быть, вернуться тогда, когда мы будем говорить про последующие стихи, скажем, стих 42, вот, где снова у нас станет вопрос о том, как у нас относятся ребенки, простые люди, или вот, как говорил Джоэль, у нас дети, рабы и женщины находятся на одном и том же уровне. Но давайте уж, раз мы сейчас заговорили про стихи 38-40, мы какие-то здесь вещи отложим до того момента, когда будем говорить про стихи 41-42, а сейчас пока что прочтем 38, 39, 40. Лариса, если вам это удобно.
Ефе ауто го Иоаннес, дидασκале, эйдомен тина энто ономатису, экбалонта диамония, кай экалюмен аутон, готи ук экалютей гемин. Оде Иисус эйпен, ме колюте аутон, Удейсгар истил гос поесе дюнамен и пито ономатиму кай дюнес сетай тахю каколо гесайме. Госгар ук эстин кат гемон юпер гемон эстин.
Иоанн сказал ему: «Учитель, мы видели человека», понятно здесь, что мы вполне можем греческой неопределенной местами перейти как человека, который твоим именем изгоняет бесов. Мы запретили ему, потому что он не ходит с нами вместе, не является вместе с нами твоим последователем. Если пока что говорить просто про русский перевод, может быть, я не совсем счастлив от выражения «он не ходит с нами вместе», мне пока что ничего лучшего в голову не пришло. Акулутео. Нету каких-то альтернативных идей? Русскоязычная часть нашего семинара.
Но, может быть, все-таки он не следует за нами?
Он не следует за нами. А понятно, что это имеется в виду?
Ну, здесь тогда двусмысленность возникает. То есть он не идет вслед за нами в прямом и в переносном смысле.
Хорошо, давайте, может быть, действительно сделаем чуть-чуть ближе к синодальной версии «не следует за нами». Окей? Иисус ответил: «Не запрещайте ему. Кто, призвав мое имя, совершит чудо, тот не сможет сразу же после этого хулить меня. Здесь я перевожу греческое «тахью» как сразу же после этого. Если у него все равно получается возможность того, что он потом будет хулить, но как, словно бы на протяжении какого-то времени тот факт, что он совершил чудо, его будет удерживать. Да. Кто не против нас, тот за нас. Я буквально на полсекунды отлучусь, должен все видеть. Да. Простите, что мы на секунду отойти. Are we right in the idea that tahyu means some time interval during which the one who made miracle in the name of Jesus would be immune from the inclination of blasphemy. What does this mean? And later he can revert.
Yeah, I'm not sure I want to press it to that extent.
So is my translation of tahyu as сразу же после a kind of over translation?
No, it's a literal translation. I'm just not sure if it's meant to be taken to the extent of implying what you just said, that, maybe afterwards he will come to curse Jesus or something like that. I mean, if I said, if I jump up and down, you won't quickly forget that. Am I necessarily implying that you will eventually forget it? Or is it just a way of, making my point with intensity?
Okay, good point. Лариса, у вас был вопрос.
Да, мне кажется, что, может быть, тахью тоже что-нибудь такое поставить, что тоже обладает метафорическим смыслом, не только временным. Например, сейчас, Господи, вылетело слово. Тотчас же начать хулить меня, да? Но, по-моему, я не тотчас хотела сказать, вылетело.
Но мне кажется, никакой разницы нету. Сразу же.
Вот, знаете что, я хотела сказать так, тут же начать хулить меня, вот.
Какая разница между тут же и сразу же?
По-моему, тут же обладает метафорическим смыслом, ну, в смысле, что человек делает противоположные вещи. Он не может делать одновременно одно и второе. Но одновременно не в смысле в один и тот же момент времени, а в смысле, что делать противоположные вещи.
Окей. У нас тут для нашей демократии не такой уж большой парламент в настоящий момент есть. Но давайте спросим других носителей русского языка. Ирина, Вячеслав. Не сможет тут же. А как предлагаете скорее эту идею тахю перенести внутрь глагола начать, да?
Ну да.
Не сможет тут же. Тут же начать курить меня.
Угу.
Окей. Кто за предложение Ларисы? Поднимите руки на экране или компьютерной лапкой. Окей. А кто за тот текст, что у нас был на экране до сих пор? Поднимите руку на экране или компьютерной лапкой. Слава Богу.
Вячеслав, как евангелист Лука.
Может быть,
Что-что?
разночтение дать, я не знаю, мне нравится и то, у каждой версии, у каждого варианта есть свои какие-то коннотации очень хорошие.
Я говорю, он как евангелист Лука.
Да. Может, действительно, вот начать заставить.
Угу, можно и так, да.
То есть здесь вот эту идею быстроты мы переносим не, говорим не про то, когда кончится период, его как бы невозможности хулить, а что он начинается сразу же, да? Может быть, так даже немножко мягче, да. Хорошо. You made a slight amendment. Сразу же начать хулить меня.
Yeah, I see. Yeah. To start to follow
Мгм.
me. Yeah. Yeah, that's good.
Окей. Ну вот, следующие стихи, они, с одной стороны, продолжают вот уже начавшуюся перекопу про детей и так далее, как бы про антииерархию, да. И здесь, конечно же, вот опять же выражение «Рейстон микрон тутун» тоже продолжает ту же самую тему полемики против иерархии, как бы, которые мы видели. Не великие вот люди здесь важны, которые здесь спорят насчет того, тисмейдзон, да? А вот вопреки этому тисмейдзон самые главные у нас люди это вот они, наоборот, гой микрой. Вот, но, наверное, поскольку тема достаточно уже сам по себе большая, то мы уже к ней вернемся в следующий четверг.
We can talk about this more next time, but
Yes,
a lot of
yes.
people say that, you know, this section, you know, it's difficult to discern a structure to it, and it's woven together with, you know, catchwords. People say
Mhm.
like ton mikron. You know, that word and similar words appear throughout, but with different meanings. You know, so what you may have are sayings that come from different sources that have all been kind of thrown together um, in maybe already at the stage of oral transmission, on the basis of similar words, because that makes it easier to remember. But we could pursue that some more next time.
Спасибо. Thank you, Joe. Спасибо всем, кто с нами был сегодня. Увидимся в следующий четверг.
Спасибо.
До
See you.
свидания.
До свидания.
See you